The fog shrouded the narrow streets of Oak Creek tightly, as if the town were under a soft, suffocating blanket. A light wind stirred the bare branches of the trees, and no sound broke the morning silence, only the barking of a dog in the distance. The camera moved slowly along the deserted street, showing neat houses with well-kept yards. But among them, one house looked different. The home of Jessica Mason, an artist known in the city for her reticence and infrequent public appearances, stood out for its peeling paint, overgrown front garden, and the faint light burning behind the bedroom curtains. The silence was broken by sirens. A police car pulled up in front of the house, red and blue lights reflecting on the wet pavement. Sergeant Joe Carter and Officer Loris got out of the car. Joe looked tired, his rough features and dark circles under his eyes giving away the appearance of a man used to long night shifts. Loris, the young officer, was reserved, but he looked wary, as if he sensed that something was up. Joe, another call here, that's the third one this month. You think it's another empty alarm? Loris, I don't know, Sarge, but the neighbors say the lights are on all night and the door doesn't lock. Something's definitely wrong here. Joe, this house has always been weird. Even when I first started working, there was always something going on here. The place is cursed. You'll see. They walked to the door. Joe knocked several times, but there was no answer. Loris looked around. The street was deserted. Even the birds seemed to have stopped. Joe knocked again, harder this time. Joe, Miss Mason? It's the police. Open the door. There was no reply. After a short pause, Joe gingerly grasped the doorknob. It was unlocked. He exchanged a glance with Loris, tension in his eyes. Joe, shit, the door is open. That's already a bad sign. But Loris, do you think she's inside? Joe, we're about to find out. The door opened with a quiet creak, letting them inside. The camera followed them, showing the interior of the house. Shoes were in the hallway, an old rug on the floor. A faint smell of paint wafted from the living room. On the table was a cup of unfinished coffee covered with a thin film. Brushes and paint cans lay nearby, some of them open. The floor was strewn with drawings, scattered in all directions as if they had been thrown in a hurry. Loris picked up one of the drawings. It showed a dense forest with dark, barely distinguishable figures between the trees. The other drawing, which she picked up next to it, showed a man in a long cloak, and behind him protruded a huge shadow with horns that looked like tree branches. Loris, kind of creepy for a regular artist, don't you think? And Joe, she's always been a little weird, but this is like something more. As Joe approached the table, he lightly touched the coffee cup. The bottom of the cup was cold. Joe, the coffee's cold. She left it at least a couple hours ago. Loris, maybe she got out? Or someone made her come out? Joe nodded quietly toward the bedroom. Joe nodded for the door that led to the bedroom. Joe pushed it open with his shoulder. The door opened slowly, and an ominous picture appeared before them. The camera showed a close-up of their faces. Joe froze, his eyes widened, and Loris involuntarily covered her mouth with her hand, holding back a shriek. Jessica Mason was lying on the floor. Her body was curled up, one arm stretched toward the bed, the other clenched into a fist. Her hair covered half her face, but even through it, a frozen expression of horror was visible. On the wall above her body was a strange symbol scratched out with something sharp. It looked like a circle surrounded by lines that looked like tree branches. In the center of the symbol was an eye. Loris, what the hell is that thing? Their gazes lingered on the symbol and then began to survey the room. The camera slowly showed details: a torn curtain on the window, scratches on the floor, traces of dirt leading to the windowsill. Down on the... Lorez moved closer but then backed away, as if she felt uncomfortable. Joe, it's not just murder. It's more than that. Joe leaned over Jessica's body and noticed that her fingers were clenched into a fist. He put on gloves and gently unclenched her hand. Inside was a small piece of paper with the same symbol drawn on it as on the wall. Joe, she knew she was going to be killed. That sign, it's not just a drawing, it's a message. Loris pointed to a window that was ajar. Loris, I think someone went out the window. Can you see the footprints? Joe walked over to the windowsill and examined it closely. There were faint traces of dirt on the wood, and there were boot prints on the floor beneath the window. Joe, let's get this to forensics. Maybe we'll find something. Joe stood up and picked up the walkie-talkie. His voice sounded confident, but there was tension in it. Joe, we're going to need forensics. And get Detective Davis on the phone. This is her level. Lorez stayed in the room, her gaze still fixed on Jessica's body. She felt a chill run down her spine. The camera again shows the symbol on the wall and lingering on it for a few seconds. The suspenseful music intensifies until the screen darkens. The fog around Jessica's house grew thicker and thicker until a dark car pulled up to the scene. Its headlights cut through the gray haze, illuminating the grassy driveway leading to the house. The car door opened, and Detective Rachel Davis stepped out. She was a woman in her 40s with a short haircut, stern features, and an attentive gaze. She went straight to the front porch where Sergeant Joe Carter was waiting for her. His figure loomed dimly in the light of the street lamps, and he was smoking a cigarette, leaning against the wooden counter. "Joe, Rachel, you're just in time. I'll tell you right off the bat, this isn't just another murder. I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of service." Rachel, "Then tell it all from the beginning." She walked past him without stopping. Joe threw the cigarette butt on the ground, put it out with his shoe, and followed her inside the house. The camera follows them, showing Rachel removing her gloves from her coat pocket and putting them on as if she were ready for work. Joe, "The victim is Jessica Mason. Artist, lived alone, body was found in her bedroom. The symbol on the wall, we've never seen anything like it before. Door was open, no sign of forced entry. Bedroom window was ajar too, but the weirdest thing is her drawings. Or hiding it. They entered the living room. It seemed chaotic. Dirt on the floor, a cup of cold coffee on the table. Rachel looked around the room carefully, her keen eye fixated on the scattered drawings. She slowly picked up one of them. The paper depicted a forest, thick and dark, with barely recognizable human figures standing among the trees. Rachel, forest. Silhouettes. That means something. She picked up another drawing. It showed a man with a huge shadow that resembled tree branches. The lines were jagged, as if drawn by a trembling hand. Rachel, it's not just art. It's her fears. Joe stepped closer, watching her study the drawings as if trying to decipher them. Joe, the neighbors say she was strange, always silent, lights on in the house at night, didn't invite anyone over. Weird or scared? Joe fell silent as Rachel put the drawings back on the table. She headed for the bedroom. The camera followed her down the hallway where the faint lamplight drew shadows on the walls. In the bedroom, everything was as it had been discovered. Jessica's body was lying on the floor, one arm stretched out toward the bed, the other clenched into a fist. Her hair partially covered her face, but the look of horror was visible even so. Rachel stopped in the doorway and just stared at the scene in silence for a few seconds. Rachel, where's the symbol? Joe pointed to the wall above the body. The camera showed a close-up of the scratched sign, a circle with branches inside, with an eye in center. The lines were sharp, rough, as if someone had scratched the wall in a hurry. Rachel, did you send it anywhere? Joe, the photographers took pictures, but I don't know what it is. Maybe some kind of a cult? Or maybe it's just a psychopath who decided to draw. Rachel walked inside, crouched next to the body, and scrutinized Jessica's hand. Her fingers were tightly clenched. She put on gloves and gently unclenched them. Inside was a small piece of paper with the same symbol drawn on it, Rachel. That sign. It was important to her. She was trying to tell us something, to send a message. She tucked the piece of paper into a plastic bag and handed it to Joe. Then her gaze fell on the torn curtain at the window. She moved closer, carefully pulled back the fabric, and peered outside. There were traces of dirt on the windowsill and faint boot prints on the floor beneath the window. Detective Rachel Davis stood at the edge of the woods, watching their work closely. Beside her was Sergeant Joe Carter, who, with his arms crossed over his chest, looked he wanted to be anywhere but here. Joe, I never liked these woods. There's always been something creepy here. And now this. Rachel, forests don't kill people, Joe. People do. Or the things that hunt them. She adjusted her coat and stepped forward, scrutinizing the ground beneath her feet. The camera shows her walking down the path, her footsteps almost silent on the soft, wet ground. She is followed by Officer Lors and 2 other police officers. Joe, what did he say? Rachel, Jessica left the house around 11 o'clock. She had a tall man in a long coat with her. They went into the woods. Joe, forest, that's already starting to sound even worse. Rachel, yes, now we need to find out who this man is and what they were doing in the woods. The camera shows Rachel looking at the forest, sinking into a silent fog. Her gaze is cold and focused. The music builds up as the camera slowly switches to the trees, where the fog grows even thicker and the branches seem to fold into barely discernible silhouettes. Then the screen goes dark. The sun was setting, but a thick fog still shrouded Oak Creek, making the forest a dark, mysterious place. Police lanterns illuminated the narrow path leading into the thicket. Several uniformed officers scoured the area, moving cautiously forward. That, so far, had been good thus far. So check it out. But I couldn't make out his face. They walked toward the woods. It's weird, you know? She's never been out this late. Rachel frowned, mulling over what she had heard. Rachel, are you sure it was a man? Ed. Absolutely. He was standing next to her, and then they walked into the woods together. I even thought maybe it was one of her friends. Ed! But now that I see all this, he waved his hand toward the police cars and the sharp smell of chemicals emanating from the house. Rachel, thank you, Mr. Miller. If you think of anything else, give us a call. She turned back to Joe, her face expressing deep concentration. Joe pointed to an elderly man who stood at the edge of the sidewalk holding cane. He was Edward Miller, a war veteran and a longtime resident of Oak Creek. He was watching the policeman closely, but was in no hurry to interfere. Joe, that's Ed Miller. He lives two houses down from here. Says he saw Jessica last night. Rachel, really? Then I'll talk to him. Rachel made a few notes in her notebook, then asked another question. Rachel, did you see anyone leave or enter the house? Kevin, no, I didn't look long, but the car stood there for about 10 minutes and then drove off. Rachel nodded, setting aside her notepad. Rachel, thank you, Kevin. You've been a big help. She walked back to Joe, who was waiting for her outside. Joe, so did the boys see something? Rachel, black car, headlights shone dimly. That matches what we already know. We should check the cameras in the neighborhood if there are any around here at all. Joe, only one camera at the intersection, but it's old, and it's not picked up anything. Rachel, have it checked out. Anyone else want to talk? Mary, we rarely crossed paths with her. She was always quiet, withdrawn. Kevin said he saw her a couple times when she was walking in the woods, but we didn't socialize. Rachel shifted her gaze to Kevin, and he straightened immediately, as if preparing to give a report. Rachel, Kevin, did you see something last night? Kevin, yes, miss. I was sitting in my room playing on my computer. It was around midnight, and I looked out the window and saw a car. It was parked right in front of her house. Rachel, did you get a good look at who was in the car? Or maybe the license number? Kevin, no, it was too dark, but I definitely remember it was a black car. It had headlights that were kind of weird, like dimmer than usual. The head of the family, Tom Harper, a man in his 50s with gray hair and a good-natured face, sat on the couch. Next to him was his wife Mary, who was nervously rubbing the edge of her sweater. Their son, Kevin, a teenager of about 15, sat at the kitchen table, watching with interest. Rachel introduced herself, briefly explaining why she was here, and addressed Tom first. Mr. Harper, did you notice anything last night? No unusual sounds or movements? Mr. Harper, Tom, no, nothing like that. My wife and I went to bed around 10 and slept until the wee hours of the morning, didn't even know anything had happened until we saw the police cars. Joe nodded and pointed to the house across the street. Joe, this is the Harper family home. The Lores are with them now. Rachel heads toward the Harper house. The camera follows her as she crosses the street. She was met at the porch by Officer Lores, who already talked to the neighbors and made some notes in her notebook. She had a look of mild disappointment on her face. Rachel, ait gorgieto. Pachoferes. What do you got, Lores? Mr. and Mrs. Harper say they haven't heard anything, but their son claims he saw a car outside Jessica's house last night. Rachel, where are they now? Lores, inside. Let's go. They walked into the Harper house. It was a cozy but slightly cluttered house with toys strewn across the floor and family photos hanging on the walls. Their faces expressed a mixture of curiosity and concern. An elderly man wearing a jacket labeled Oak Creek Veterans Club and a young woman with a child in her arms stood out among them. They stood a little apart, trying not to draw attention to themselves. Rachel Davis, meanwhile, was already finishing her examination of the scene. She stepped out of the house, gloves off, and walked toward Sergeant Carter, who was standing outside his car with his arms crossed over his chest. His grim expression added to the overall oppressive atmosphere. Rachel, did any of the neighbors see or hear anything? Joe, not really. People either haven't noticed or don't want to talk, but a couple have volunteered, but their testimony's all a blur. Rachel, okay. Let's start with whoever lives closest. Rachel, this is Davis. I need you to check one sign. I'll send you a picture. Maybe it's popped up somewhere before. She tucked the phone into her pocket, looked around house one last time, and headed for her car. The camera lingers on the house, then slowly moves to the bedroom window. The symbol on the wall is shown again in close-up. The screen darkens. The street outside Jessica's house was getting busier and busier. Police cars blocked the road, flashing their lights. Forensic officers with cameras and evidence bags went in and out of the house, carefully marking each step. Residents of nearby homes began to gather on the sidewalks, whispering to each other. She walked past John Loris, glancing at the symbol on the wall. A theory was already forming ahead, but it lacked details. Rachel, send the drawings to be analyzed and find out who might have known Jessica. I want a list of everyone who's had contact with her in the last few months. Joe, do you think it's someone in her entourage? Rachel, I think all of this is no accident, and I'm going to find out why. She walked out of the house, stopped on the porch, and pulled out her phone to make a call. The camera shows her looking off into the distance, and her mind is clearly spinning with thoughts of the strange symbol, the drawings, and what could have brought Jessica to this end. Rachel, someone was here or came through the window. Joe, we'll get the footprints to forensics. Maybe we can lift some prints. She turned around slowly and looked at Jessica's body again. Her gaze was cold, analytical, but there was a faint flicker of tension in the depths of her eyes. Rachel, she knew she was going to be killed, but she didn't have time to tell who did it. Joe nodded thoughtfully. Loris, who had been standing in the hallway silent all this time, finally spoke. Loris, did the neighbors say anything helpful? Joe, only that they saw a black car outside the house last night. No one remembered the license plate number. Rachel, check the cameras on the street. If the car was here, it could have gotten caught in the lens. Joe stood up, crossing his arms over his chest. Joe, Rachel, you do realize that this is starting to look like something much bigger than just a murder, right? If there really was a cult here, maybe we're dealing with something that's still going on. Rachel, I know that, Joe, but until we find a motive, we'll just be going in circles. Later, in the gallery. The building, despite the late hour, is still open. They are greeted by the young curator, Mark Halloway, who looks slightly surprised by this visit. Mark, Detective Davis? What can I do you? Rachel, if the chapel belonged to the Rivers family, that explains a lot. Jonathan might have known about her past. Perhaps he was looking for answers, and now Jessica finds herself caught up in it. But why? Loris put the folder on the table and continued. Loris, one more thing. The records say that the last person to officially attend the chapel was a pastor named William Harks. His name is also mentioned in connection with the disappearances. He said to have believed in something that dwells in the woods. Rachel stood up abruptly, her gaze becoming focused. Rachel, Harks. We need to find everything related to this man, where he disappeared, what he was doing. Maybe he's connected to this cult. They left us a trail. That symbol, it's the key to everything. We have to find out what it means. At that moment, Officer Loris entered the office holding an old folder. Loris. Detective. I found something in the archives, at your request. The chapel you were in was once owned by the Rivers family. Are you sure? Yes. Jonathan's great-great-grandmother built it in the early 20th century. But here's the strange thing. In 1981, the chapel was closed after a series of disappearances. Several people went missing in the forest area, and after that, the local authorities stopped maintaining the building. It stood abandoned ever since. Rachel frowned, her thoughts beginning to form a disturbing picture. She set the pendant aside and reached for the map of the forest. There were several markings on it, including where the ritual circle had been found and an abandoned chapel. Rachel. Joe, have you ever heard anything about cults in the area? Maybe local legends or rumors? Joe was silent for a moment, pondering the question. Joe, well, there were always strange stories in Oak Creek, especially about the woods. The old-timers say that back in the 70s there was a group of people who did rituals here, some kind of cult. Allegedly, they were trying to contact something they said lived in the forest. But it all sounds like stories. Rachel glanced at the pictures of the ritual circle. Rachel, these aren't bikes, Joe. This is something real. There's blood on it, but it's not Jessica's, it's a man. And here's the important thing. The DNA matches the samples we already have in our database. It's Jonathan Rivers. Rachel raised an eyebrow, her gaze even more attentive. Rachel, Jonathan Rivers? The painter? Joe, yeah, he disappeared about a year ago, remember? His work was always dark, strange. We never found him, but his paintings are still on display at the local gallery. He seemed to be pretty famous. Rachel hesitated, running her hand through her hair. Rachel, it can't be a coincidence. Jessica was an artist, just Rivers. She painted strange things too, and now we find his blood near where she died. Joe leaned forward slightly as he continued. Joe, one more thing. The pendant we found in the woods has partial fingerprints on it. They belong to Rivers, too. Rachel took the pendant and twirled it in her hands, scrutinizing the engraved symbol. Rachel. If Rivers was there, that means he's probably still alive. Or someone is using his tracks to throw us off. In the Oak Creek police station, night was falling. Only a few desk lamps illuminated the desks, darkening the rest of the room. Rachel Davis was concentrating on the evidence collected at the scene. Nearby on the table were a burned drawing of a symbol, a pendant, photographs of a ritual circle that had been found, and a map of the woods that marked an abandoned chapel. Her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock on the door. SGT Joe Carter entered the room, carrying a folder of forensic results. Joe, Rachel, the lab finished analyzing it. There's something interesting. He put the folder on the table and sat down across from her. Rachel, tell me about it. Joe, first of all, the cloth you found in the woods. Rachel, I hope I find it, or at least what he left behind. They stepped inside. The floor of the chapel was covered in a layer of dust, but a fresh trail left by boots was clearly visible in the middle of the room. Rachel slowly followed the trail until she stopped in front of the altar. On it lay a book, old and shabby, with a leather cover. She opened the book, and the camera shows pages scribbled with strange symbols and drawings. Among them was again the same symbol they had seen on Jessica's bedroom wall and in the forest. Rachel, this isn't just a murder, Joe. This is a warning, and I think it's just the beginning. The camera lingers on a page of the book, showing a close-up of the symbol. The music builds up, creating tension until the screen darkens. Rachel, there's an old chapel nearby. It's abandoned. I think it might be worth a look. Joe, do you think it's related? Rachel, I don't think so. Joe, I know. Late evening, an abandoned chapel. The camera shows Rachel and Joe's car pulling up to an old chapel. The building looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. The walls were cracked, the windows were broken, and the door was warped. The car lights illuminated the front of the building, but beyond that, the woods slipped back into thick darkness. They got out of the car with their flashlights on. Joe illuminated walls of the chapel, which showed strange marks that looked like handprints. Joe, nice. Are you sure we won't find some maniac in here? Joe, in the car, of course. What you up to? Rachel, if they came here, it means they had a purpose. Maybe this place isn't random. I want to know what's in the neighborhood. Later at the police station, Rachel sat at her desk with a map of the forest spread out in front of her. The circle of branches and rocks was marked with a cross, but another detail caught her attention. A few kilometers away from the clearing was an old abandoned chapel that hadn't been visited in a long time. Joe entered the office, interrupting her musings. Joe, Rachel, forensics are done with the cloth. There's traces of blood on it, and it doesn't belong to Jessica. Rachel, so it's a man? Or someone else was there? She stood up, pointing Joe to the map. She stood up, signaling to the officer to gather everything for examination. Her gaze lingered on the circle of twigs. Loris, it's like some kind of ritual. Maybe she was part of something? Some kind of cult? Rachel, or the person who killed her did. But why? To intimidate us? Or to confuse us? Joe was surveying the area around the circle. His eye caught something shiny sticking out of the ground. He bent down and pulled out a small metal object. It was a pendant on a chain engraved with the same symbol. Joe, looks like it's becoming more than just murder. Rachel, let's get this to forensics. Maybe we'll find some prints. Rachel looked around, her gaze intense. The forest suddenly seemed too quiet. Even the birds had stopped singing, and the breeze no longer moved the branches. Rachel, Joe, do you have a map of this forest? Finally, they came to a small clearing where an officer stood lighting something on the ground. As Rachel approached, the flashlight illuminated a strange circle made of twigs and rocks. There was a small pile of ashes in the center of the circle and a burnt piece of paper lying beside it. Rachel squatted down, scrutinizing the find. Joe, what the hell? Rachel, it's not an accident. Someone left this here intentionally. Maybe they were burning something. She carefully took the burned piece of paper and unfolded it. And on one side she could still make out part of the pattern. The same symbol had been scratched on Jessica's bedroom wall. Rachel? That sign again. They're trying to hide something or leave a message. But to whom? The faint sounds of a walkie-talkie and the rustling of branches can be heard in the background. Loris. Do you really think she could have come here with someone? Why? Rachel. People don't always act logically, especially if they're afraid, and Jessica was clearly afraid. She stopped, crouched down, and picked up a small scrap of cloth caught on a bush branch. It was black with a faint tear in the edge. Rachel. Black coat. Loris, do you think it could be him? This man the old man saw? Rachel. I don't know yet. Send it to forensics. Loris nodded, carefully wrapped the cloth in an evidence bag and stowed it in her bag. Meanwhile, one of the officers, scouring the woods with a flashlight, called out loudly, "Officer! Detective! Something here!" Rachel and Joe quickly head in the direction the voice came from. The camera follows them, showing them making their way through the thick vegetation. His nose and a corduroy jacket and his intelligent appearance immediately caught his eye. He sat down across from Rachel, his book neatly laid out in front of him. Hunt Loris explained the situation. Do you want me to translate this book? It sounds interesting. Rachel. It's not just a translation, Professor. We need to understand exactly what it says here. We think it's connected to a series of crimes. Hunt picked up the book, turning the pages carefully. Hunt? It's a medieval text. Officer Lors entered the room with cups of coffee, placing one in front of each person. Lors. You both look like you've been run over by a truck. Did you find anything in the chapel? Rachel. More than you bargained for. This book could be the key to everything. But I need a translation. She took one of the pages and showed Lors the text, written in elegant but faded script. Rachel. Can you get someone from the university? We have a history department. Someone in that department needs to know Latin. It's an emergency. Lors. I will. But... Rachel, are you sure this isn't going too far? It's just murder, right? Rachel looked at her, then at the book. Rachel, no, this isn't just a murder. We're already dealing with something beyond the ordinary. And the more we learn, the more I realize that Jessica and Rivers may have been part of something terrible. Meet the professor. 2 hours later, Professor Edward Hunt, a historian from the local university, arrived at the station. He was middle-aged with glasses on his nose. And, Joe, if this sign is the key, someone is already using it. We need to figure out who before it's too late. The camera pans upward, showing the forest from above. In the distance, behind the dark crowns of the trees, a faint light can be seen, as if someone is them. The music increases and the screen darkens. An early morning in Oak Creek met Rachel and Joe at the police station. Their eyelids were heavy with fatigue, but their thoughts were keeping them busy. On the table in front of Rachel lay a book found in the chapel dungeon. Its old pages smelled of mold and time, and the Latin text demanded deep analysis. Joe, great. Now we're also out of touch. Rachel picked up the book from the altar and looked at Joe. Rachel, let's go. If we stay here longer, we could be the next victims of this cult. They began to move back down the corridor, but the whispers they had heard earlier grew louder and louder. The voices sounded like a multitude of people speaking phrases in an ancient language. Return to the surface. When Rachel and Joe returned upstairs, they found that the chapel door they had left open was now locked. Joe, wasting no time, kicked it open with his shoulder. They stepped out into the fresh air, but the night seemed even more ominous than before. Rachel, we found what we were looking for, but this is just the beginning. If this cult is still active, we're in danger, and we're not the only ones. Joe looked at her, breathing heavily. The figures around him held candles in their hands. Under the image was carved the date, 1981. Rachel, this is the year the chapel was closed. This must be the last ritual performed here. But who was this person? And what were they trying to do? Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a loud sound. The door in the hallway slammed shut, and the camera, illuminated by their flashlights, shuddered. Shudder. Joe pulled out his gun, and Rachel grabbed the walkie-talkie. Rachel, Whitman, this is Davis. We're in a chapel dungeon. We may need help. There's a chance someone else is here. But the walkie-talkie only responded with a crackle. Rachel, this book, it describes rituals. It talks about the calling of those who watch. about the sacrifices that must be made for them to reveal their wisdom. Joe, it's a cult. It's all reality. Joe, who had been standing at the entrance, suddenly tensed. He felt movement behind him, but when he turned, he saw nothing. Joe, Rachel, we're not alone here. I heard something. Rachel tore herself away from the book and turned to him. Hey, Rachel, Joe, don't panic. Let's just finish the inspection and get out of here. She walked over to the wall, where she noticed another carving. It depicted a man standing in the center of a ritual circle with his hands raised up. The walls of the passageway were carved with symbols similar to the ones they had seen before. The light of their flashlights brought out more and more frightening images from the darkness. Eyes, figures in cloaks, scenes reminiscent of rituals. Soon, they came to a small chamber where an ancient altar stood in the center. On it lay the remains of candles and another book covered in dust and cobwebs. Rachel cautiously approached the altar and opened the book. The pages were written in the same Latin text as the inscription in the chapel. Josie! Whatever that means, it doesn't sound too reassuring. Rachel straightened up and turned her attention to the walls of the chapel. Her intuition told her there was something else here. She walked over to one of the wooden panels and ran her hand over it. The panel moved slightly. Rachel, help me! It could be a hidden passageway. Rachel gave him a shoulder, and together they pulled back a panel, revealing a narrow stone passage behind it. The passage led down into the darkness, where a faint, almost imperceptible sound came from, like a whisper. Joe, are you sure you want to go down there? It looks like the beginning of a bad horror movie. Rachel, we came here for a reason. If we want to understand what happened to Jessica and Rivers, we have to go all the way. The chapel dungeon. Rachel and Joe walked slowly down the narrow stone staircase. So right before they left, the air became increasingly damp and the musty smell grew stronger. The carving showed the same ritual circle as Jessica's drawings and Jonathan's paintings, but at its center was a man surrounded by hooded figures. His face was turned upward and his eyes seemed empty. Rachel, look at this, Joe. It's not just a symbol, it's a ritual, or perhaps a sacrifice. Joe stepped closer, frowning his forehead. Joe, I don't like this, Rachel. If someone's still doing this, then we're dealing with something much bigger than just murder. And Rachel continued to study the carving until her gaze fell on the words carved beneath the image. They were in Latin. Illi qui spectant numquam relinquent. Rachel shuddered, as if the words echoed deep inside him. The old wooden door, covered with moss and cracks, seemed an insurmountable obstacle, but Rachel didn't hesitate to push it open. A creak echoed through the silence of the night like a warning. It was cold inside, despite the summer night. In the center of the room still lay the charred remains of the book they had found earlier. The floor showed the remains of old ritual symbols scratched or drawn decades ago. The cobweb-covered wall murals depicted scenes that increasingly disturbed Rachel. Joe, nothing seems to have changed since we've been here. But honestly, I don't want to find any surprises again. Rachel flicked on the flashlight and directed the light toward the back wall of the chapel. There, in the very corner, she noticed something that had escaped their attention earlier. It was another carving, covered in a layer of dirt and soot. She stepped closer and gently ran her hand over the image. Rachel, did you know Jessica Mason? Mark, yes, she was acquainted with Jonathan. They sometimes discussed their work, but I don't think they were close. Jessica was too withdrawn. Rachel pointed to the painting of the chapel. Rachel, did Jonathan say anything about this place? Mark, he called it the place of beginning. But he never said anything else. Sometimes he would paint for hours like he was in a trance. It was strange. The camera shows Rachel looking at the painting. Her eyes linger on one of the cloaked figures whose facial features are barely visible but who resembles Jessica to a frightening degree. The music builds up as the camera moves to a close-up of the painting, and then the screen slowly darkens. The darkness of the Oak Creek forest was becoming almost palpable. The police car's flashlights cast long, ominous shadows on the trees. Rachel Davis and Joe Carter stood in front of the abandoned chapel. Rachel, we're investigating a case involving Jonathan Rivers. We need to see his paintings. Mark led them into a spacious exhibition room where Rivers' macabre works hung on the walls. The camera showed close-ups of paintings depicting dense forests, cloaked figures, strange symbols, and rituals. One of the paintings shows a circle of twigs with an eye in the center, just like the one found in the forest. Rachel, that symbol, does it appear in all of his paintings? Mark, yes. Jonathan used to call it the sign of those who look. He used to say it was the key to understanding his work. Really, no one ever understood what he meant by that. Rachel held her gaze on one of the paintings. It showed a forest with an abandoned chapel in the center, surrounded by hooded figures. The man collapsed to the ground, dropping the knife. She quickly ran up to him, handcuffing him. Rachel, "Who's they? What were you trying to do?" But the leader only smiled, his eyes glittering in the firelight. "Leader, you'll find out. Very soon." Consequence. When the operation was over, the police detained 5 members of the cult. The others had managed to escape into the woods. The man lying in the center of the circle turned out not to be Jonathan Rivers, but he was alive. He was taken to the hospital where he was unconscious. At the site of the ritual were strange symbols carved into the ground, and the book the leader had used. The pages were covered in blood, and the text contained passages that were not in the book found in the chapel. However, instead of obeying, several of the cult members began to scatter in different directions. Joe rushed after one of them, and Rachel headed for the leader, who was still holding the knife over the victim. "Rachel, drop the knife now!" The leader turned to her. His face beneath the mask seemed calm, almost peaceful. "Leader, you don't understand anything. You can't stop it. They're already here." Before he could strike, Rachel shot him in the leg. About a dozen people in black cloaks stood in a circle around the fire. Their faces were hidden by masks depicting the same symbol. In the center of the circle was a body. A man, bound and lying motionless. Rachel, whispering. "Wait," she signaled to the Lore's group to get ready. Cult leader's voice. "Those who are watching are waiting. Our sacrifice will bring us closer to the truth. We will open the gates, as our ancestors before us did, and learn what is hidden from the rest of us." The leader raised his knife, pointing it at the bound man. The crowd began to whisper words in Latin that echoed through the forest. "Rachel, ladu, 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 ladu. The operation is about to begin." Police officers burst into the circle, pointing their guns at the participants in the ritual. "Rachel, drop the knife. Everybody on the ground." The abandoned cemetery, surrounded by dense forest, looked frightening even from afar. The moon barely illuminated the old tombstones, covered with moss and cracks. In the distance, the faint light from the fire was visible, and muffled voices could be heard. Rachel and Joe, with flashlights off, moved slowly, trying not to make a sound. The second group, which included Lores, was approaching from the other side. As they approached the bonfire, a scene opened up in front of them that made them freeze. Plan of operation. Rachel assembled a small team of 4 officers, including Joe and Lores. They agreed to split into 2 groups to surround the neighborhood of the cemetery. Professor Hunt, staying at the station, continued to decipher the book, hoping to find something that would help them prevent the ritual. Rachel, our goal is to stop the ritual and apprehend the participants. But be careful. If they really believe in what they're doing, they could be dangerous. Joe, checking his weapon, smirked. "Joe, dangerous. Rachel, we're dealing with fanatics. It's always dangerous. A cemetery in the woods." Joe, who was sitting with a mug of coffee, shook his head. "Joe, the forest is huge. If we just scour it, we won't find anything. We need something concrete." At that moment, Loris entered the room, holding a clipboard. "Loris, detective, I checked the footage from the drones that have been patrolling the woods for the past few days. A campfire was recorded last night in the western part of the woods. The area matches where the old cemetery is located. Could this be what you're looking for?" Rachel nodded. "It matches Jess's drawings. Some of them have images of graves and light coming from the ground. I think this is the place." Their findings at the farm and the mysterious masked man confirmed it. The cult is still active. What's more, it was preparing a new ritual and time was running out. On the wall of the meeting room hung pictures of all the evidence. Jessica's drawings, Jonathan's paintings, symbols from the chapel and the farm, and excerpts from the book translated by Professor Hunt. Rachel stood in front of this grim mosaic, trying to connect all the dots. "Rachel, your allies with feet. Rachel, if we're right, the ritual should take place tonight. Everything fits. The symbols, the sacrifice, the location. They're using the forest as a cover. But when exactly will it take place?" The door opened abruptly, and a man in a dark cloak, his face concealed by a mask, entered the room. He stopped when he saw them and raised his hands. "Unknown. You don't understand. You are interfering in something you have no power to stop." Rachel didn't pull her gun away as she approached him. "Rachel, who are you and what do you know about Jessica and Rivers?" The man smiled beneath the mask, his voice sounding cold. "You unknown, you have already made your choice. Those who are watching will find you." Before they could apprehend him, he threw the smoke bomb sharply to the floor. The room filled with thick smoke, and when it cleared, the man was gone. Night thickened over Oak Creek again, filling the forest with the sounds of whispering wind and creaking trees. Rachel and Joe, after leaving the farm, returned to the station to devise a plan of action. On the altar was a handwritten note. Rachel picked up the note and read it aloud. "Rachel, we're close. Those watching are ready. The sacrifice will soon be made." Joe frowned, his hands clenched into fists. Joe, sacrifice? Are they going to do it again? And who will be the next victim? Rachel looked around the room, her gaze lingering on a painting leaning against the wall. It was the work of Jonathan Rivers. It depicted a girl with long brown hair standing in the center of a ritual circle. "Rachel, it's Jessica." They planned this from the beginning, but before they could discuss their findings, footsteps were heard outside. Someone was approaching the house. Rachel and Joe looked at each other, their guns pointed at the door. Rachel and Joe pulled into the driveway. The road to the farm was confusing, leading through narrow paths and thickets of woods. Finally, they reached an old house surrounded by weeds and a broken fence. "Joe, the place looks like it was abandoned decades ago. Why would Jessica be here?" They got out of the car, keeping their guns at the ready. The farmhouse door creaked as Rachel pushed it open. It was dark inside, but fresh footprints were visible on the floor. Someone had been here recently. "Rachel, look closely. This place has clearly been used recently." In one of the rooms, they found a strange altar, similar to the one in the dungeon of the chapel. There were images of the same symbol on the walls, but now they were painted with fresh paint. Joe, leaning against the wall, stepped into the conversation. "Joe, what does that mean? Were they trying to summon some kind of demons?" Hunt leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Hunt. Not exactly demons. It speaks of ancient watchers who supposedly see everything that happens in our world. Their knowledge is infinite, but their presence destroys the minds of those who call upon them." Rachel looked at the book, then at Hunt. "Rachel, what about the date? We found a reference to 1981. That have any significance?" Hunt turned a few pages again. "Hunt, it's possible. If the ritual was performed in 1981, it could be related to cycles. It mentions here that gates can only be opened once every few decades when certain conditions coincide. Perhaps 1981 was such a time." Rachel sighed, her thoughts returning to Jessica and Rivers. "Rachel, so what if someone tries to do it again now?" The hunt begins. A few hours later, Rachel received word from the lab. The tests showed that the clothes Jessica had found had traces of soil identical to that found in the area of an old farm outside of town. This farm had long been abandoned, but it was near the chapel. It's badly damaged, but it looks like a manuscript devoted to occult practices. Judging by the style, it could be 15th century. Rachel leaned closer. "Rachel, can you translate something right now?" Hunt smiled and began to read. His eyes were immediately drawn to the symbols that were repeated on many pages. "Hunt, these symbols, this is the sign you call the sign of those who watch, right? It says here that this symbol is used to summon higher beings. But there is a caveat." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Rachel, what caveat?" "Hunt, those who use this sign must make a sacrifice. And the sacrifice is not just physical, but spiritual. It has to do with the concept of opening the gate for these beings. The text says that those who watch can bestow knowledge, but only at the cost of destruction. This is just the beginning." Rachel and Joe looked at each other, but didn't say a word. They dragged Rivers and the cult leader out of the mine where the other officers were already waiting for them. Final scene. Later that night, Rachel sat in her office, rereading the notes from the book. Her mind was heavy with thoughts. They had stopped the ritual, but the figures she saw seemed all too real. Her musings were interrupted by the phone ringing. She picked up the receiver. "Foreclosed," whispers. "Unga pasi." They went to go find the guys. They ran into her in the hall. She said, "Daddy, it was horrible." "Do you think this is the end?" "They're watching you, always." The line cut off. Rachel, clutching the receiver in her hand, turned around slowly, but there was only silence in the room. "Rachel! Joe! Don't look at them, just work!" She fired at the figures, but the bullets passed through them without any damage. The cult leader lying on the ground laughed. Leader, you think guns can stop them? They are beyond your comprehension. Rachel ran up to the circle and knocked over one of the candles, disrupting its integrity. The light began to fade, and the figures began to disappear, as if they were being pulled back into the circle. Rachel, hurry up, Joe. We've got to get him out of here. Joe finally freed Rivers, and they dragged him outside the circle. The cult leader tried to get up, but Rachel hit him with the butt of her gun, knocking him out. Its implications. When it was over, the cave fell into silence again. Rivers was conscious, but he looked completely exhausted. Rivers! They're still here. You don't understand. And I was like, What are you saying, Rivers? And he goes, River! The light in the center of the circle grew brighter and brighter, and vague figures began to appear in the center of the circle. They looked fuzzy like shadows, but their presence was physical. Rachel felt a chill creep into her bones. She took aim at the leader, but he only smiled. Leader, you won't be able to stop it. The Watchers are already here. Their truth will change everything. Rachel fired, this time hitting the leader in the shoulder. He fell to the ground, but continued to whisper in incantations. Rachel, release Rivers, now, oh! Rushed toward the man, cutting the ropes, but at that moment, one of the shadows approached him. It was huge, shapeless, but its presence pressed on his mind. Joe froze, his breathing becoming ragged. Lita, you don't understand anything. We've already done everything we need to do. They are here. You are too late. Rachel shot into the air, trying to scare them. Rachel. I said get away from him. But instead of obeying, the leader raised his hands and began to whisper something in Latin. But at that moment, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and the candles in the circle flashed with a bright light. Joe! What the hell? Rachel, what's going on? Climax. The rest of you, cover us outside. They entered the mine, keeping their weapons at the ready. Inside, the walls were covered with the same symbols they had seen before. The air was heavy with the smell of dampness and something metallic. Soon they came to a large cave. In the center was a circle of candles, and inside it was a man. It was Jonathan Rivers, dressed in a white shirt stained with blood. He was tied to a pole, and around him stood the 3 remaining members of the cult. Finished washing it, including their leader, who had now removed his mask. Rachel, drop your weapons and get away from him. This is your last chance. The leader turned to Rachel, his face expressing a strange calmness. Rachel, we have no choice. If they complete the ritual, who knows what could happen? We have to stop them now or never. Gorge. The journey to the gorge took almost an hour. When Rachel, Joe, and the 2 other officers arrived, the night was at its peak. The moon was barely visible through the thick foliage of the trees. The only landmark was a faint light visible in the distance. As the group approached, they stopped in front of the entrance to the old mine. Light came from within, and voices singing in an ancient language through the corridors. Rachel! Oh, whispered Rachel. Joe, you come with me. Hunt nodded, his fingers running over the text once more. Hunt, and if this book is to be believed, the ritual is only complete if the sacrifice leads the Watchers to the light. It sounds like something symbolic, but it could have a direct meaning. Rachel. That means they're not done. Someone from the cult escaped, and they'll probably try to complete the ritual. Regathering the team, Rachel put forward a plan. This time they couldn't afford any slip-ups. The gorge area was dangerous and difficult to access, so they decided to take only the essentials with them. Laura stayed at the station to coordinate operations. Joe, are you sure this is a good idea? Climbing into a den of fanatics? Professor Hunt joined Rachel a few hours after the cult members had been apprehended. His face expressed a mixture of fatigue and anxiety. He spread the 2 books in front of him and began to compare them. Hunt, this place, this gate. Judging from the text, it's not just a metaphor. It says they are in a place where the shadow of the forest meets the roots of the earth. That may be an accurate description. Rachel looked at the map of the forest lying on her desk. Rachel, the shadow of the forest and the roots of the earth. It could be a ravine in the northern part of the forest. There were once mines there, and the trees form a thick canopy. You've made a mistake. Those who are watching are already near. The voice disappeared, leaving only silence behind. Rachel froze, her breathing quickening. The camera shows a close-up of her face, then slowly, the window's shadow flickers outside, but when Rachel turns around, there's no one there. A shadow flickers outside the window, but when Rachel turns around, there's no one there. The screen gradually darkens, leaving the audience in tense silence. It was getting close to midnight, but Rachel couldn't afford to rest. Her office was littered with documents and evidence, but none of them gave a complete picture of what was going on. The book found in the cemetery was even more sinister than the previous one. Its pages described not only rituals, but also a place called the Watcher's Gate. Loris, what the hell is this? Did they have another book? Rachel. I guess we should get her to hunt. Maybe she'll tell us more. Joe, returning from a forest chase, looked distraught. Joe, 3 got away. We couldn't catch them. But I saw one of them. He was without a mask. It was someone from around here. Rachel frowned. Rachel, if it's someone local, he can lead us to the others. We need to find out who he is. Final scene. Later that night, Rachel returned to her office. She stared at the symbols, which now seemed even more ominous to her. Jessica's picture lay on her desk, her bright smile a stark contrast to the darkness she was drawn into. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie on the table hissed. Voice,